Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here today with Neural DSP's latest virtual amplifier rig, the Omega Ampworks Granophyre. The last three guitar-centric plugins out of Neural DSP have revolved around their Archetype series concept, acting as signature packs for different artists to achieve their entire tonal spectrum in the digital plugin world. Whereas Granophyre returns more to their roots with stuff like the previously released Fortin Nameless and Fortin NTS series, where this comes in with less features, a lower cost, and acts as more of a virtual amp rig for someone that's looking at this standalone either amplifier or amplifier and cabinet combination. And there are a couple more elephants in the room besides just the Archetype series that will ultimately play into my recommendation today, but we'll get to that sooner rather than later. So let's go through the features of Granophyre, which, if you're familiar with Neural DSP at this point, you probably have guessed what is in this plugin. So we won't spend too much time on the basics like the UI and the presets, the gate, all that stuff is still there. It's still sleek, easy to use, no complaints. Since this marks the 8th plugin that I've covered from Neural DSP, I figured, what the hell, let's change things up and go from back to front, starting with the cabinet section, which, as you might expect, since Omega Ampworks is indeed the star of today's show, this features an Omega Ampworks cabinet, and it's quite a good sounding one, and this cab section breaks the mold of some of the previous Neural DSP plugins in a way that I enjoy, even if it is rather subtle. So you still get a lot of the same features you'd expect. In stereo mode, you can pan them. You got 180 degrees out of phase options, different level, distance, positions to mix between the different impulse responses. You still got a lot of the same microphones that you'd come to expect, although they do include one new one, the SM7B, which I'm happy to see. I really like a 7B on guitar cabinets, and especially it works well with this. But the new feature here is that there's actually two different speakers, and that's not new in the sense that, like Archetype Nolly had 4 different cabinets you can choose from. But my biggest complaint with that is you give us so many options, but we can't mix them together within one instance, whereas you can here. So you'll notice there is a MS1260 and a VM1265 category to where you have basically doubles of the microphone options, but for each individual speaker. So you can stick with one speaker in different microphones. You can use the same mic in different speakers, different mic, different speakers. And this gives you a much wider tonal spectrum than I think any of the other standalones have had in the cabinet department. And personally, I find mixing different speaker models is a really good way of getting you to a more balanced, kind of even-tempered, mix-ready guitar tone in the box. You don't have to do as many things, I find, once you kind of mix different microphones and speaker combinations. Of course, you can do that with one cabinet, but it does add a bit of tonal richness in the same way that maybe quad tracking with different amp models does. And I have to hand it to Omega and even their marketing in this instance. This cabinet is very balanced, very hi-fi sounding. I tried out the Nameless and the NTS heads through this. They sounded really great, kind of more thrashy compared to the contemporary sounds you get by default with the V30s that are included in that plugin. So very good cab, good speakers, good combination, definitely a good fit, though I wouldn't expect anything less since we are using an Omega amp head here. Before that, there's of course the standby graphic equalizer, which as of recording this video is still not in the Fortin Nameless or NTS, which if it wasn't in this plugin, I might, give it a little slack, but they obviously think it was a good idea to put it with this amplifier. So I'll ask once again, pretty please, Neural, put this thing in NTS and Nameless. That would be absolutely great. It's a GEQ. I use it in basically all my presets. And then of course we arrive at what everyone's excited for, the Omega Granophyre, which follows the same path as the Nameless and NTS in not using the actual amplifier's name. This is obviously based off of the Iridium, which is like a 1.5 channel amplifier versus their bigger 2.5 channel Obsidian, I believe it's called. In terms of feature sets and tonal capabilities, I would put this amplifier model closer to the Fortin Nameless, and perhaps in between that and the overdrive channel of the NTS than anything else Neural DSP has released. And I say that because this is, again, kind of a 1.5 channel amplifier. It's basically one channel with a high-low gain switch. And even then, it's very subtle, like especially around the noon regions, you're talking maybe a 6 dB, at most 10 dB cut, and I don't even think it's that aggressive when you switch to the low channel. That is to say that unlike the Fortin Nameless, which I found to be a pretty decent substitute for a lot of lower gain plexi tones, not quite JTM 45 area, but getting there. This one, you never get rid of the dirt completely, which is fine for some stuff, but this is by far my least favorite clean-ish amplifier out of the 3 standalone suites that they've released so far. The NTS clean channel beats them all for me. To my ears, there's some very evident pre-gain stage filtering going on in this amp to the point that I can take about any of my guitars, especially the 6-stringers, and just plug straight in and get a good sound. Especially with stuff like the active EMGs, I would prefer to have a little bit more bass roll off, but this is not one of those amplifiers that you have to have some kind of boost in front to make it workable. It is more contemporary in that way, which does have the downside of, if you're using a more vintage style guitar, especially if you roll off the gain, it can sound a little thin and honky at times, but it's not really what this is going after in my opinion. And because of some of the other options included in here, you can still get some really cool hot rodded, more British style tones, even if the gain structure itself is more reminiscent of something like a modded 5150 or even Fryette/VHT sounds. I get a lot of those kind of sounds out of this plugin, which, I'm certainly not complaining. The preamp controls are relatively straightforward, though I would almost call the treble control high mids or even like middle 2. It sort of behaves like a contour more than a regular treble control would, acting as sort of like a big high mid scoop when you roll it off, and it sounds more like a hot rodded British style circuit as you turn it up. So it's definitely not the same thing as a lot of the brittleness you get out of more contemporary designs. Very powerful, which makes the bass and middle controls not quite as sensitive compared to that, but still very important to tweak your final sound, obviously. The level is your preamp level, which just like the master volume can definitely have an impact on your sound. As you crank both of them, I find the mid saturation to be a lot more aggressive, but that can change depending on the voice switch. This acts as a sort of mid-frequency tone stack shift that gives that much more versatility to an already rather capable EQ section. Of course, the master volume does as you would expect, and it reacts very realistically, just like all of Neural's stuff, but this time it's even more impressive because you can actually change the power amplifier tubes, given 6L6, EL34s, and my personal favorite, KT66, which I find they don't get enough love in the modeling world. The power amp reacts as you would probably expect. The KTs are very even-tempered. They kind of sound pushed at all times compared to the other two. The EL34s have more of a high-mid frequency focus and kind of roll off in the high end, and the 606 is your classic American sound. And of course, those aren't, inherently the fault of the tubes, but rather how they interact with the speakers and stuff. But that's a tech discussion for another day. Either way, if you're dialing in a sound, or especially your own tones, I would definitely recommend that you start with the power section in this case, because it really acts as your bedrock for the tweaks you make to the preamplifier. And this is compounded with the depth and presence circuits, which are again quite powerful. And I find the detail or presence in this case to be really wideband. I don't know exactly what it's doing compared to other amplifiers, but it definitely doesn't sound so high treble focused compared to something like their, NTS or Nameless suite. So everything up to this point has been mostly by the numbers, but the real reason I wanted to present in this order is because of the pedal section, which includes the Earthquaker device's plumes. What was exactly my reaction when I first saw this thing? I think, to my best knowledge, the reason this is included here is because Mick Thompson of Slipknot is endorsed by Omega Ampworks, and he's using this pedal in his most current live rig. Although the Mick Thompson default preset on here doesn't have this pedal engaged, which is kind of weird. It is like, the section is on, but the pedal is turned off, but I think it sounds pretty good with it on. This, at first glance, you might think is your run-of-the-mill Tube Screamer derivative, though this is more akin to like an OCD sounding pedal. It doesn't work the same way, but there's some different modes for transistor. I think it's JFET specifically, and LED clipping, and I think you can combine the two. It's a much more valve sounding overdrive than something like a symmetrical clipping diode pedal or even asymmetrical clipping diode, which is much more smooth, almost has like a staticky kind of sound. This you can actually use as like a preamp pedal. In fact, there is a preset in here, I think, called like Look Ma No Amp, and they just use this in the graphic EQ to scoop out some of the mids, and it sounds mostly like an amplifier, which is really cool. Just kind of a weird pairing. I would almost guarantee this would not be the pedal were it not, something that one of their endorsed artists used, but it is a cool inclusion. It just makes me wonder how and why Earthquaker agreed to this, and why at the end of the day they've been able to secure the intellectual property for so many pedals in a lot of their plugins, but not the amplifiers. It's kind of weird. Either way, surprising inclusion. It is pretty cool, especially for the standard metal boost settings. It is a different flavor of that. But if you're playing in mostly standard tunings on a 6-string, you probably won't need this for a lot of stuff. However, as you will see, it does behave really nicely on the low channel of the amplifier, and using this to kind of fill in the gaps. There's some pretty cool textures to be had. So with that, a few more tones out of Granophyre. Now, if I didn't have a conscience, and don't get me wrong, I ain't got much of one to begin with, I would probably say sounds good, go check it out in the video and enjoy the clicks. But I don't operate that way. So with the changes to Neural DSP's product lineup over the past year, especially in the past few months, it's making this conclusion recommendation part of the video really complicated. And for context, I'd like to turn to line 6 for a moment, and this will make sense in a moment. They have the Helix platform. You got full-blown Helix, the rack, the LT, they got the HX Effects stuff, but they also have Helix native software. And so for the price of about $400, even if you don't own Helix hardware, you can get all of the tones right on your desktop, which is pretty cool. And, I certainly have my reservations about some of the amp modeling, but plenty of people make it sound awesome. And if you own both, you can actually get a discount on the native software, use that in the studio, make compatible presets. There's like different modes you can choose for that, and take your hardware on tour or go gig with it and get the exact same sound you were getting right here. That's pretty killer. I like that a lot. Well, that's something that Neural DSP has kind of, I think, worked themselves into a corner over, because as many of you know, at NAMM 2020, they unveiled the Neural DSP Quad Cortex, their next generation amp modeler that's supposed to be super powerful, yada, yada, yada. As we made a NAMM 2020 video, Leon Todd and I, and we certainly had our reservations about some of the marketing, but to say the least, we're both super excited for it and can't wait to hear what it has to offer. But they've gone the complete opposite route of line 6, where everything that is on desktop today, including Granophyre and everything else that released before it, is exclusive unless you already have bought it or you buy it going forward. So I would have to say, at this point, if you are on the wait list for a Quad Cortex, don't buy this. Don't buy any plugin from Neural DSP going forward until this thing releases, because you can't have it both ways. And this is, I think, a big reason why Fractal Audio and Kemper and some other big players stay out of the software side of things, because you can't say, oh, we have this super powerful amp modeler that can profile your own rig. It listens to your guitar tone in the same way a human ear does, and it's all exclusive and all powerful, so you'll be able to get any sound out of it you want. But hey, go pay $100 for this, because this is different somehow. This is exclusive to that all-powerful modeler we were just talking about. It doesn't work that way. So if you are really obsessed over, being able to operate an amplifier, or you like the look and the feel, the tactile response of twisting a treble knob and looking at the artwork, then this might have value to you. But if I were you, speaking from someone in this position, if I'm on the wait list for a $1,400 product, I'm done. Like, that's it. If it can do half of what it says it can do, it's going to be able to cover all the tones that Neural DSP has released up to this point. Now, if you've already bought the stuff, you're not at a loss, especially if you're making money with it. And that's a whole separate conversation. If you're a professional that runs a studio, this is a way better investment for reamping tracks than buying this $2,000-$3,000 amplifier head, just like the other amplifier software plugins like Nameless and NTS. And that doesn't even consider the archetype stuff. There was someone who left a comment a few weeks ago, and I've seen this sentiment actually a few times since, that they were arguing that this, before this released, obviously, but this and NTS and Nameless and that class of their products are overpriced in their eyes. And honestly, I have a really hard time refuting that. In a vacuum, all of these plugins have incredible value. You take something like the Fortin plugins, you can buy both of those for the cost of a Fortin grind pedal. That's all that gets you in the real world. So for simply recording applications, and even live, if you want to do this on a laptop, they're outstanding. The problem is these don't exist in a vacuum anymore, even within Neural DSP's own, ecosystem. Compare this to Pliny or a Bossy, and it just gets shredded. You get 3 full-fledged amp channels, you get multiple pre and post effects. In the case of Nolly, if you're willing to spend $40 more, then you get, another additional amplifier channel, bringing it up to 4, all of which are pretty damn versatile amps, maybe not quite to the extent of this, but pretty close. You get 4 different cabinets to choose from, for me, it's a no-brainer. Like, I would, at this price, this makes absolutely no sense in the plug-in ecosystem. I would definitely buy one of the archetypes before I bought one of these. Don't get me wrong. I love the sound of the Nameless and NTS, and it, I do not regret paying $100 for something that sounds like a $3,000 or $5,000 amp head. But someone that's coming from a bedroom musician's background, I wouldn't buy one of these again, not in today's product climate, you could say. Again, if you're making money on this, you have a client that wants this kind of sound all day long, no question. That's what it's there for. You can justify it. But I really don't see a point in owning more than a couple of these, because by the time you buy all of these guitarist-centric plugins, which, by the way, have a lot of overlap between the Fortin stuff and even the archetype stuff, you're spending half of what it would cost to just buy the damn modeler. So I would put that money towards that. Fortunately for those of us that have already purchased pre-existing Neural DSP plugins, they will be able to transfer to the Quad Cortex, which is a good thing. That was certainly the right move. No complaints there. But let's be 100% clear. Though it may not behave exactly the same, you might not have the same knobs, and the potentiometers may have different ranges, whatever. All the sounds that I just demoed, all the sounds from the Nameless and the NTS, if you take your time and learn your gear properly, you will be able to get, within 5% error, the same kind of sounds out of Quad Cortex. It's almost a guaranteed, because, even the archetype artists that they're endorsing, Plenty, Tosin Abasi, Nolly, they've all been Axe-Fx users. Plenty was using like freeware on his earliest stuff. Tosin was playing through Pod X3s on the first Animals as Leader albums. You can get these kind of sounds elsewhere. It may not be as, visceral or quite as realistic in some ways, but once you bring their own proprietary hardware in the mix that's going to be running the same kind of modeling engine that's available in their plugins, I just don't see how you can justify both at the same time. Like, they sort of serve different markets, but they're almost overlapping in some cases as well. Because if I'm a studio guy only, and I want to feel like I'm playing through an amp and feel like I'm, actually twisting the real knobs on the amp and everything, this is a great substitute. If I want to be the deep dive gear techie nerd, then the Quad Cortex is going to be awesome, because you can go through stack parameters and different effects and all that kind of stuff and deep dive through things that probably aren't available here. But why would you need both? So I guess I'll conclude this video as follows. If you have zero interest of ever owning the Neural DSP Quad Cortex in your lifetime, these plugins can make a lot of sense. Even this one. I firmly believe they could use a good $20, $25 knocked off the price tag to make them make sense compared to the archetype stuff, because unless you're just a chug player all day long, and that's all you do, I think most players will be happier with one of the archetypes. And I definitely have my preferences there, which I talk about in those videos. But any of them, I think, can accomplish a lot of those great contemporary high gain tones without sacrificing on, the other post effects and even preamp effects like these do. So, if you're looking at this kind of amplifier sound anyway, and you don't have a 5150 or Fryette VHT kind of tone at your disposal, then yeah, sure. For me, I already have stuff that sounds very similar to this, so it won't be something I buy. Now, if you're on the wait list for the Quad Cortex, I would say from here until the time that product launches, and there's a very good chance even afterwards, do not buy any more Neural DSP plugins unless you are tracking an album and you have to have this sound. It just makes zero sense. But I would confidently bet a month's worth of YouTube ad revenue that you will be able to achieve this sort of sound out of the box with the Quad Cortex with the tools at your disposal. Hell, I bet that someone's going to make a preset of all of these plugins within a couple months of that being out and share it for everyone to use. Because that's the beauty of amp modeling. You take, something that's sort of close, you tweak some EQ before and after, throw in the right cab IR, maybe, add a pedal or two. Ta-da! You have a new amp sound. So you can't simultaneously have this, environment that can somehow achieve all the tones under the sun, but for some reason it can't sound like this, so you should buy both. I've just been less than satisfied with their approach to this. I would be much happier if they said, look, we know that there's going to be some overlap, but this is specifically for this audience. This is for this one. But instead, they've sort of doubled down and say, no, just buy both. It's great. There's a reason for it. It totally makes sense. And I don't really agree with that. So let me know what you think down below. I will be very interested to see how this affects upcoming Neural DSP releases, which I assume there'll still be 1 or 2 before then. And I'll be here for it. So yeah, thank you so very much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.